The quickly evolving United States now had a leader capable of pushing the country along its path to success. His zeal was like none other. Kansas newspaper editor William Allen White described a conversation he had with the nation's passionate leader prior to his presidency. "And we sat there for an hour after lunch and talked our jaws loose about everything. I'd never known such a man as he, and never shall again. He overcame me. And in the hour or two we spent that day at lunch, and in a walk down F Street, he poured into my heart such visions, such ideals, such hopes, such a new attitude toward life and patriotism, and the meaning of things, as I had ever dreamed men had." Roosevelt called his program, as president, the Square Deal. This involved an attack on the serious social problems facing the nation, legislation to allow the regulations of big businesses, broader control of the railroads, conservation of natural resources. In business, Roosevelt aggressively extended the federal government's power. Up to the Roosevelt administration, the relationship between government and business was laissez-faire, with people being able to do business with complete freedom. Roosevelt was the first president who felt otherwise, with the thought that the government should ensure that the economy meets the people's needs. He pushed regulatory legislation through Congress and strictly enforced the Sherman Antitrust Act. During these times, whole markets had been dominated by only a few companies, controlled by a trust, who created monopolies that could control prices. Roosevelt did not feel that all trusts were bad, but only that some were bad because they were not responsive to the needs of the people. The first businessman attacked was the prestigious J.P. Morgan, who ran Northern Securities Company, which controlled several powerful railroad companies. In 1902, Roosevelt asked the Justice Department to prosecute the trust using the Sherman Antitrust Act. In March of 1904, Roosevelt was victorious, and the Northern Securities Company broke up. The Elkins Act made illegal the granting or accepting of secret rebates, that is, repayments of shipping charges. The Hepburn Act gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the right to fix rates for railroads. For the first time in American history, the government was regulating business. Roosevelt's next target was the food industry. He labored to pass two very important acts, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. These acts were aimed at protecting consumers from the food industry, especially the meatpacking industry. Meatpackers used unsanitary meat and put inaccurate labels on cans. Roosevelt knew this firsthand from his experiences in the Spanish-American War.
He said, "If we had been given canned corned beef, we would have been all right, but instead of this, the soldiers were issued horrible stuff called canned fresh beef. There was no salt in it. At best, it was stringy and tasteless. At worst, it was nauseating. Not 1/4 of it was ever eaten at all, even when the men became very hungry."
The Meat Inspection Act authorized the Secretary of Agriculture to order meat inspections and condemn any meat product found unfit for human consumption. It also said that labels put on food had to be completely accurate. Roosevelt did have help in his fight against the meatpackers, in the form of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This book described the terrible conditions in the meatpacking factories in great detail. This outraged the public, who immediately gave Roosevelt their support. The acts were passed in 1906. Roosevelt, although focusing a great amount of attention on domestic issues, was certainly not an isolationist, and pursued a great aggressive foreign policy. The U.S. began to intervene in many of the affairs of countries in the Caribbean. Roosevelt stated that the goal of the U.S. was to have prosperous neighbors, and that a country that paid debts and kept order, quote, "need fear no interference from the United States." Countries that did not keep order, however, required the policing of the U.S. To the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary, which stated this opinion, and began the United States' reputation as a world police. The Roosevelt Corollary was invoked in a number of countries after 1904. Roosevelt had more aspirations in the Caribbean than just to police it. He still sought an interoceanic canal, which had eluded the country for decades. But many problems had to be worked out before Roosevelt's dream could become a reality. First, an 1850 treaty bound the U.S. to build a canal in cooperation with Great Britain. But Roosevelt didn't want to share control. He wanted to have total control. In 1901, this issue was resolved when the British were convinced to give up their part of the canal in exchange for a guarantee that the canal would be open to all nations. The next issue was deciding where to build the canal. It was eventually decided to build it on the Isthmus of Panama, where the French had already begun to build. The last problem was the biggest. At the time, Panama was a province in Colombia and so could not negotiate with the U.S. The U.S. had to negotiate with Colombia. Colombia rejected a negotiated treaty which upset Roosevelt to a great extent. To a great enough extent that he actually alluded to the fact that the U.S. would support a revolution in Panama. The revolution occurred in 1903 when Panamanian nationalists staged an uprising using American money and support. November 6th, Panama was officially recognized as a country, and 12 days later, America had the right to build the Panama Canal. The canal, which was finished in 1914, was possibly Roosevelt's greatest achievement while in office.
But Roosevelt was not done achieving his goals. To the west lay a vast wilderness where Roosevelt spent cherished years, but with industrialization, pollution was increasing, farmlands were overused, and forests were depleted. Extractive industries such as oil, gas, and minerals were proceeding at an unfettered pace. Roosevelt committed himself to protecting the wilderness and life in it that he had come to love. During his presidency, he managed to double the number of U.S. national parks. The Antiquities Act of 1906 still preserves archaeological sites on public lands, requiring federal agencies to manage and preserve these natural resources for scientific, commemorative, and cultural values. It is estimated that well over 200 million acres of land were granted protective status by President Theodore Roosevelt during his terms. Roosevelt dedicated for preservation over 150 national forests, 51 bird preservations, 18 national monuments, 21 federal irrigation projects under the New Lands Reclamation Act of 1902, and designated 5 national parks. Today, he has his own national park named after him, commemorating the great strides he made to protect the beauty of the United States. In 1908, Roosevelt ended his second term as president, but never stopped being active. A year after, in 1909, Roosevelt went on a year-long hunting trip in Africa, and then toured Europe. He ran for presidency again in 1912, but came in second to Woodrow Wilson. Throughout all this, Roosevelt maintained the same level of popularity that he previously had as president. He gave speeches to large audiences all over the country. Roosevelt continued to keep up his manly image. He never stopped boxing until he lost eyesight in his left eye during a fight. In 1912, during his campaigning, he was shot in the chest entering an automobile. After a 90-minute speech in Milwaukee, Theodore Roosevelt finally sought medical attention. January 6, 1919, at age 60, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep of an arterial blood clot. At his funeral, crowds of people came to remember the man who had influenced their lives so much. Theodore Roosevelt's legacy was never forgotten. His achievements and reforms made huge impacts that still last today. He is remembered as one of the greatest presidents in American history. If you travel to Keystone, South Dakota, you can see his face, carved into the side of Mount Rushmore, with the other great presidents of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. There, he forever looks out onto a country that he affected so greatly.
Theodore Roosevelt had a thrill when he led the Rough Riders up